Hey there, it's Rachel Mullins, the host of Hashtag No Filter Fridays on Public House Media.
Strike three, you're out.
Welcome back to Caught Listening. Broadcasting is part of the Public House Media Network, the baseball podcast that goes beyond the white lines. Christian Heimall here with you. As we are every single week, you can find us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, iHeartRadio, and now on Amazon Podcasts as well. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share us with your friends and family, and also be a part of the show by submitting show suggestions or questions, whatever you may have, on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Just search Caught Listening by Public House Media or email the show, caughtlisteningphm@gmail.com. World Series is in the books, and we are into the off season, but that doesn't mean we can stop talking about the World Series, just not this World Series. For those of you tuned in last week, we teased it a little bit, but hard to believe the 20th anniversary of the Subway Series, the Mets and the Yankees, in which the Yankees really cemented their dynasty legacy at that point in time. And for those of you Mets fans, obviously another in the long line of disappointments, despite such a great season for the Mets. And what was really kind of fun at the start of this year, a friend of mine, I noticed he put out there that he was written a book about it, the 20th anniversary of the Subway Series, and figured what better time to bring him on than just after the Fall Classic. He is Jerry Beach, author of the Subway Cities Baseball's Big Apple Battles and the Yankees-Mets 2000 World Series. Jerry, how are you, pal?
Hey, Christian. Thanks for having me on, buddy. I appreciate it. All is going well. Hope you're doing well in the midst of all this craziness.
It definitely is, but I enjoyed reading your book because it there's so much about it. First of all, before we get to the way it's written and whatnot, what got you into writing this book?
Well, that's one of my favorite, most amusing stories. If you're as a writer, I've written a couple books, and you always have book ideas, and you pitch them, and they just don't land, and that's okay. It's a hard industry, and people want something that's gonna pretty broad, and it doesn't sell. It's nothing personal, and that's okay. This one just came to me. Sports Publishing approached a friend of mine, Brian Hoke from Yankees.com, and they'd had a hole in their schedule. Someone was supposed to do this book and couldn't for spring of 2020, for release in spring of 2020. Mm-hmm. And so they asked him, do you know anybody who might be able to put this together pretty quickly? And this was in June of 19. And the deadline was mid-November of 19. So do you know anyone who can write this book from start to finish in 5 months? And Brian, thankfully, said he knew me, put me in touch with them, and that got the ball rolling. But it's just funny how, like, in this business, you can get rejected 10, 20, 30 times, and then something happens and you weren't even looking for it.
Yeah, out of nowhere.
And it worked out really well for me because I'd covered the World Series in 2000. And as I like to say, all my hoarding and keeping stuff worked out because I had all this stuff in the basement, newspaper clips, stories I'd written. I had floppy disk. Remember floppy disks? I had some of those downstairs, and I have a floppy disk reader. So, it was like, somebody said, can you write a book on the 1980s Celtics-Lakers rivalry in 4 months? No, I can't do that.
Right.
But, there's three things I could write about in 4 months. This World Series, something to do with the Simpsons, and, of course, Hofstra Hoops.
And, of course, Hofstra Hoops, of course, 100%.
Of course. And this is the broadest one. So, so like I said, mid-June of 19, I remember very well the first interviews I did were at Old Timers Day at Yankee Stadium, and there's some quotes in the book that I got that day from Louis Soho and Jeff Nelson. And I was very fortunate. I'm in New York, obviously, and that summer, back when things were nice and normal, the Mets would have alumni in every homestand, and most of them were from that 2000 team. Mm-hmm. So I just talked to them at the ballpark, and then the Yankees, their legends are in their broadcast booth.
Right.
So O'Neill, Cohn, it was pretty easy to get those guys too. So I was very fortunate, and I was able to get to both parks pretty easily, and fill in any holes I might have had by talking to guys who were readily accessible. I got Joe Torre in a dugout. He was doing his safe at home, talking about safe at home. I got him at the Citi Field dugout, in mid-September of 2019. So it was just, it came together. Like I said, you'll put together proposals for books and they kind of perish on the vine. And then this one just, can you do this? And if you can do it, great. We need it by such a date. So, all right, I can do that. And, it was, I really enjoyed covering it in real time. And it was a blast to revisit again. So it was a pretty easy decision to say yes to it.
Yeah. And again, it's because, it's one of those series that it gets a lot of it gets a lot of fond memories simply because it's the Yankees and the Mets. And it's the first time that has happened in like 5 decades, whatever it was.
Yep.
Overall, the game, the series wasn't that there were all very close games, and they probably could have gone either way, but you almost felt, especially, and you detail this in the book, especially in Game 4, that it was over when the first pitch is thrown in Game 4. Derek Jeter's leadoff home run off of Bobby Jones. But what about this series captivated so many people to the point where it bears going back to 20 years later?
Well, it's like, I think the end quote in the book was Bobby Valentine saying, we never had Cubs, White Sox, never had Angels, Dodgers. We got Yankees-Mets, and it's freaking cool. And I think also, let's just say for argument's sake, the Yankees and Mets played in 2000. And then they played again in 2001, and 2004, and whatever. If they played 4 or 5 times in the World Series since then, I think 2000 wouldn't be as noticeable. But it was the first time in 44 years, and I think at the time, certainly, biased up here in New York, we thought, okay, this is, if not a sign of things to come, it'll happen again at some point in the next few years, and it never did. 2006 was the best chance.
Right.
The Yankees got knocked out in the first round. Mets, on the Carlos Beltran caught looking. So I think the fact that it was the first time in 44 years, the first time since, because if you're our age, you always read about the Subway Series every year. Yankees, Dodgers, Yankees, Giants happened all the time, center of the universe. And then baseball expanded, and there are more teams to get to fight through to get to the World Series. And then they had the divisions, and LCS played. Then they had the wild card. Then now you have, this year we had 16 teams, but I think going forward, I think we'll have more than 2 wild cards. So it's not just enough just to be the best team in your league, like the Dodgers / Giants and Yankees were in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Right. Now you got to be the best team in your league and survive 3 or 4 playoff rounds. So it was a really cool, everything was aligned sort of way, and we've learned in the last 20 years how rare that was, how hard it was for that to happen, to get the matchup, this particular matchup. And even this year, it's Tampa Bay. It was Tampa Bay versus Los Angeles.
Right.
I think it was only the 4th or 5th time since the wild card era that the top 2 seeds, the 2 teams with the best records in each league, made the World Series.
Yeah.
There's so much random stuff that can happen. It's not March Madness, but it's close enough.
Right.
So I think you can throw all that in there, and now it's 64 years since the last. We had one Subway Series in 64 years. It's really cool, and it kind of. And I think that sticks with people, and it's a cool thing that if you were around, you got to experience. And if you weren't, if you're younger, if you're not old enough to remember that, you want to, and you're a big baseball fan in New York, you want to see it again. And then I think also the fact that it was just, every game had something that you remembered. A certain, you only have to say a couple words. Game 1, Timo.
Yep.
Game 2, Clemens, Piazza. Game 3 was kind of routine. The Mets won it, but the Mets won it, and it's the only game they won. So you remember that. Game 4, as you said, Jeter homers leading off. Game 5, Soho's 1,000 bouncer up the middle. So every game, even though it was a 5-game series, as you said, could have gone either way. And it's fun to look back on and say, what if the Mets hang on in Game 1? What if Benitez strikes out Paul O'Neill and gets a 3rd out, and they go up 1-0, and Clemens, he pitched better from ahead than behind in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. What if they're down 0-1? What happens then? He was revved up and crazy for Game 2 with a 1-0 lead. What happens if they're trying to avoid falling behind 2-0, going back to Queens?
Right.
So even though it was a quick series, and it was quick, it was 6 days or 5 days. It was so much to be parsed and to be looked back upon and second guessed and stuff like that. That it just it still lingers to people who saw it and watched it and enjoyed New York baseball as a really cool thing that happened that, like Bobby V said, hasn't happened in L.A. It hasn't happened in Chicago. It's just happened here. And it's just so rare and unique, and it's cool to look back on it.
And that's what part of it is. And I mean, not being a native New Yorker, and I think a lot of people have this anti-New York bias when Yankees and Mets all get together, all against the, when the Knicks were good a quarter century ago, when the Giants, there's this anti-New York sentiment. And so you look at it, and it's the majority of people, because you even detail that in the book, that like outside of New York, maybe it wasn't the biggest story, but in the media mecca of the world, with the most recognizable franchise in the world and their little brother playing, who's just fighting for relevancy after 20 years, almost 20 years of what the Mets were after '86, it just felt like that was it. Really, even though it's two teams in the same city, it felt like the world was watching it to the people within that realm. We're talking with Jerry Beach, author of the Subway Series. Subway Series, Baseball's Big Apple Battles, and the Yankees-Mets 2000 World Series. The thing I love about this book is honestly just how much detail you put into the history of New York City baseball. And again, not being a New Yorker native, but understanding and learning more about the history of the Giants, the Dodgers, what the Yankees were throughout the periods of time when the Mets came around, the 70s for the Yankees, everything, the Mayor's Trophy, which I had completely forgotten about until reading. But then also just, again, it sparked into my mind, and I brought this up last week on the show that I don't think people realize, but like, again, I almost forgot that if Steinbrenner hadn't been suspended, Derek Jeter may never have made the Yankees big club. You go into the detail, the history of New York City baseball. How much fun was that for you as a baseball guy to look back over the century plus of baseball played in New York City?
That was a lot of fun. And it's funny because the publisher kind of gave me a rough outline that they kind of put together, and they wanted, the history of Subway Series ball in New York, and which I did too. And I kind of looked at it, and originally had kind of just starting as like an encyclopedia from early 1900s to 2000. But I was fortunate to have some pretty good first person recollections and quotes and interviews about the World Series. I didn't want to have the first two chapters be dry recitation of stuff from books and other sources. So my idea was to kind of like you saw, intersperse it. So game one was about I made Yogi the hook because Yogi had coached, managed, or played in, I can't remember the top number off the top of my head, but every New York World Series, or every New York team in the World Series, Yogi had been involved from the 40s until the Yankees' last title in their dynasty in the 70s. And even in '86, you can make a case he was involved because he was the coach of the Astros,
right?
Which is just a hilarious picture if no one's ever seen it. Google Yogi Berra Astros. Yogi and those rainbow unis is hilarious. But so I wanted to kind of mention the history in a kind of a way to kind of bring it together with the current time as opposed to kind of being dry. And game three was a perfect spot to kind of mention the Mets, rough beginnings and their decades long pursuit of the Yankees and just how differently they were built and how different the fan bases are. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. And like I said, the book kind of came together quickly. So I bought a handful of New York baseball history books, and we had long planned, long before this book came, long before I got the book, we planned a trip to Disney in August of 2019. And I had to be the only guy in Disney carrying around Roger Clemens biographies and Roger Kahn books about the Brooklyn Dodgers, as because I'd read on the shuttles, and then we get back to the room at night and I'd read for a while. But as baseball guy, this stuff. You just it's in your base. You know of it, but it's really great to read more about it. And to I read, it's in the book, kind of like the similarities between Casey Stengel and Joe Torre. They were both, they weren't losers. I'm not saying they were losers, but the rep was, they couldn't get a team over the top. They were pretty good managers, pretty good players. Joe's a better player, but they weren't, they managers. And then they're in their, they're getting older, 50s, 60s. They get one shot at the Yankees, and they turn them into dynasties. And every move they make works. Roger Kahn called Casey Stengel's, luck black magic like.
Right.
Everything Joe did worked out.
Yep.
He
for a guy who was 100 games under 500 as a manager when he was hired.
Right. And he'd said it, I thought I was done because he'd managed 3 teams he'd worked for, the Braves, Mets, and Cardinals. He's out of teams he'd worked for.
Right.
And so, he's 56, 96, he's 55, on 56 he got hired. It's like, all right, I'm home, I'm paraphrasing, but in other words, if it doesn't work out, what's the risk?
Mm-hmm.
And instead it worked out, and, he's a Hall of Famer, and as you said in the book, it's everything he's done, is thanks to stint with the Yankees.
Right.
So it's just fascinating to look at the similarities between the managers, and it's fascinating to kind of track the, how the Mets of 2000 were a really good team. Obviously, they made the World Series, but how they were kind of like a ragtag bunch in terms of, Piazza, 62nd round draft pick.
Right.
Robert Ventura had a really bad ankle injury that some thought might end his career in '97. Todd Zeile, a really good player, played for about 1,000 teams.
Mm-hmm.
Just, Benny Agbayani was a 30th round draft pick out of a Division II school in Hawaii.
Right. All
these kind of like different pieces came together, not misplaced parts, but they were just guys who had all kind of struggled to get to where they were and could enjoy where they got to, and Met fans can appreciate that because it's not a linear path for the Mets.
Right.
And then the Yankees, Jeter, like you said, if Steinbrenner doesn't get suspended or banned, who knows what happens. But those few years gave Gene Stick Michael a chance to kind of say, okay, let's just kind of rebuild us back up and flush out some of the guys you don't think can win with us and build a culture. And he traded for Paul O'Neill, who's, was just, the linchpin of that team. And, they got Tino Martinez after 95 season. And then by the time they won in 96, there was enough evidence that it was working. Mm-hmm. So that I'm sure George had his moments, and you saw in the book, he was, at his rabid best in the World Series in 2000 because you can't lose to the Mets.
Right.
But he'd been gone just long enough, and they had succeeded by other people, Cashman and Watson and Torrey doing their jobs. Said, okay, let's leave it alone, and now the Yankees are probably maybe the most stable team in sports, or at least in baseball. Yeah. I mean, Cashman's been GM for 20-odd years. They've had, Torrey, 3 managers since 95?
Torrey, Girardi, Boone, since 95. Yeah. I mean, and it's what's great, one of the things that I love, again, the thing I love about reading the history and learning the history of the game is that we are in such the information age right now. The social media age of gimme, right now, this is what I need. We forget the history of the game, or we refuse to learn it. And I always love going back and looking at the history of baseball because there are moments, there are relationships. Baseball is such a small world. And 162 minor league affiliates, 30 major league teams, X number of independent clubs, college, all that stuff. But baseball is still such a small world. And I don't think, without reading this book, I would have really remembered the relationship and the path crossed, the entanglement of Joe Torre and Bobby Valentine, the managers in this World Series. Yeah.
Like you knew about it a little bit. I being around, being in the New York area my whole life, you kind of knew, vague things, you read about it. Mm-hmm. But down to Joe and Bobby playing in Joe's last game.
Right.
Joe, I don't think Bobby pitched hit for him, but I know Bobby played in his last game. But Joe and Bobby were, teammates. Right. Joe was his manager. And Joe was the guy who said, I'm not sure he can play anymore. And Bobby didn't like that. And then he realized, he's probably right. I'm probably pretty beat up. And, and just, and that's in the late 70s. And then 20-odd years later, their paths cross again.
Right. And
it's kind of at that time, and I think in the 70s and early 80s, they were probably in the same boat. Joe was a much better player, but managerial-wise, he just couldn't get over that hump. Mm-hmm. And he had some not so great teams. And he was just another guy, in Bill Parcells' term, a Jag. Right. Then he gets to New York, across town, and now he's the Hall of Famer. And Bobby's still that scrappy, I'm going to try and put together this potluck supper, guys, and try to beat your brains in. And like Todd Zeile had said, you could tell that Bobby, when he managed against the Leland, or a Torrey or a Cox or a La Russa, really got revved up because those were the guys he thought, and I think he was right. He was as good as those guys, but didn't get, his teams were just a little bit short and they were kind of overlooked. And he wanted to prove that he was as good as those guys and his players were as good as those guys, as those teams. Whereas, and Torrey would have been in that same boat, 20 years earlier, managing the Mets, managing the Braves, managing the Cardinals. The Braves had that one great year where they won 13 in a row to start the year, won the division, and then kind of petered out. He was that guy, kind of like trying to take on the establishment. And then all of a sudden, the Yankees win 96, and then 98 is, the greatest team maybe of all time. Mm-hmm. And you can't get any more establishment now than Joe Torre and the Yankees.
Right.
And here comes Bobby V, still the underdog, still the kind of like to stir things up, kind of like the tweak the establishment guy coming in with his team. And it's just fascinating. And again, like you said, you remember they were kind of connected through their end of their playing days, but you forgot just how similar those paths were. And then how, they veered off when Joe became manager of the Yankees. Makes it even more fascinating that now, there's like a double layer of what Bobby's trying to accomplish, knocking off a former peer.
Right.
And then Joe, of course, is a Queens guy, a New York guy, a Manhattan guy. So another thing, like you said, nothing like being carried off the field in your hometown to win a championship.
Exactly.
And that's what he did,
We're talking with Jerry Beach, author of the book, The Subway Series, Baseball's Big Apple Battles, and the Yankees-Mets 2000 World Series, 20th anniversary of that World Series in which the Yankees defeated the Mets 4-1, despite all 5 games being very close and very exciting as well. That series, the 2000 series, is the one that kind of really, truly, fully cemented the legacy of the core four in Jeter, Posada, Pettit, Mariano, Bernie involved in there, the fifth Beatle.
Yeah, poor Bernie. I never got that. Bernie was there, drafted, I think signed in the 80s.
Yeah.
And, he played center field. It wasn't like he was a DH or a lefty. He played center field.
He played center field.
It was Posada, Pettit, Jeter, Bernie. The lack of love for Bernie has always kind of boggled my mind. He doesn't seem to mind. He's kind of bemused by it all too, I think. But anyway, you're right. So the core four plus one.
But the thing that is so amazing to me is I look at it, and again, reading this book was a great way to relearn the history of it. I almost wonder if in today's day and age, the core four cemented their legacy, yes, 100%, but the way that 2000 Mets team was put together by Steve Phillips and his group, and the way the rocky, at best, relationship between Steve Phillips and Bobby Valentine to put that team together in today's social media era, I don't know if the Mets make it out of the All-Star break.
Yeah. It's funny because this was 20 years ago this spring, where Wharton-gate happened, where Bobby V got in trouble in hot water. He made a speech on an off day at University of Penn's business school.
Right.
And afterwards, some fans came up to him and started asking questions. And Bobby just, God bless him, doesn't have a filter. Can't say no to anything.
Right.
And so he said, he would have preferred they not acquire Derek Bell because he wanted to play Agbayani.
Right. Why'd
you sign Ray Ordonez because he can't hit? I'm paraphrasing, but he made some pretty bold statements. And, end up dodging getting fired then because, it was 2000, and then there was no Twitter, and this kid, a guy named Brad, posted it on the Mets message board, which is crazy to think about now.
Those pesky message boards.
Bobby, Steve, what's that?
Those pesky message boards.
Those pesky message boards, yeah. How innocent those days now seem.
Yep.
And Steve had said, if I find out you said this in a speech, you're fired. Bobby said, okay, I didn't say it in a speech. Now, he did not say it, but he said it in passing to some kid he just thought he was shooting the breeze with.
Right.
But yeah, and that was a big deal in 2000. I remember that very, very well. And you really thought for a couple of days, Bobby might not survive this. Mm-hmm. And then they were winning, and so they kind of hung on. And as also, he was in his last year of his contract, so was Steve. I'm not sure that management ownership wanted to move on at that point. But in 2020, if that happened, oh man, I mean, Steve was an old-fashioned guy, and he said he liked to talk to the press every day because, that was the conduit to the public and helps sell papers and helps sell your team. Nowadays, teams don't feel the need to do that. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that Steve talked every day and Bobby talked every day. It'd be every day of, Bobby would talk at 4, and then you go to Steve, and Bobby said this, and then they go back to try to get Bobby. Steve said this, and I'm not sure if they could have lasted. Not that they lasted long, if you think about it. They lasted just parts of 5 seasons, right? Yeah, Steve took over 97, and Bobby was fired in 2002. So they were together for 5 plus, tumultuous seasons. And both said, they wished it worked out better. Steve had lost his job briefly. He took a leave of absence after news of an affair within the office leaked out, and he came back, was kind of closed himself off, and Bobby thought that Steve thought that Bobby wanted his job because Bobby was one of the temporary GMs or part of the ownership, part of the GM group when Steve was on leave. And so, it was probably poor communication on both sides. It could have been handled better by both sides. And look what they did not getting along.
Right.
They made the World Playoffs in 99. Should have almost made the World Series in 99. Almost became that first baseball team to come back from 0-3 in a best of 7. And I think if they win Game 6, they win Game 7. And then that would have been a great Subway Series because you would have the Yankees at their absolute peak, and the Mets, I think, that was their best team since '86. And then they make the World Series in 2000, obviously. And then 2001, they have a great run right, before and after the terrorist attacks that got them back in the swing of things. So, it was a good run, but I think they both were a little bit melancholy. They could have been a little bit better. And yeah, in 2020, in the 2010s and early 20s, I'm not sure how if they could have lasted 5 years. But, they were at the forefront of the manager and GM maybe not always getting along.
Right.
Back then it was kind of like the manager ran the show and the GM was in the shadows, and Steve, was peers of Billy Beane, and Billy was starting that whole the moneyballization of front offices, where the front office runs the show and is the best known personality. And that's I see maybe that was some Bobby's an old school guy. Steve, was the GM dressed in a suit and tie every single day, even on 95-degree days at Shade. Steve would come out in a suit and tie, and it was different. It was Frank Cashy, the old general manager. The '86 team was a former sports writer and a horse racing guy. Kind of, he looked like a sports writer. Steve was very slick, very, very, very corporate. He exuded a sort of corporate cool, and now that's what we got. Steve had a master's in business, and he worked as a motivational speaker before that. And now, baseball world is filled with corporate guys. Yep. So in some ways, those two were kind of ahead of the curve. And I'm sure if you took Bobby V and Steve Phillips and dropped them into 2020, I would imagine that they would handle themselves differently than they did in 2000.
Yes,
100%. Just because the way the culture is now, you wouldn't have a GM and a manager openly sniping at each other.
Right. I want to ask you a couple more questions here before I run out of time. But the image that is popped up across when people think the 2000 World Series, at least for me, the number one image that sticks into my head is part of a broken bat being hurled at Mike Piazza. And the surrealness of that moment, and you go into great detail explaining, like even recapping the broadcast moment by moment, word by word of Joe Buck, Bob Brenly, Tim McCarver, just going, what is happening here? Yeah. In that moment, if you could try to encapsulate it somewhat quickly, in that moment, because you covered that World Series, what's going through your mind?
What the what? I mean, it's just so weird. And what I forgot until I rewatched it was how fast it happened. It was like a minute.
Yeah.
Piazza grounds out or hits the ball. Clemens chucks the bat. Dude, what's your problem? Benches the bullpen's empty. Clemens says he thought it was the ball, and teams get separated and they restart play and he grounds out. And it's like, okay, it happened so fast. And there was game 2. That I certainly think that how it happened helped the Yankees because it was weird. I think they were already winning. I know it was top of the first, so they weren't winning. So I think they took the lead at the bottom of the first. And Clemens, he probably should have been thrown out. I mean, he should have been. He threw a bat at a guy. And all this happened. I think if, like Turk Wendell said, if it was me and I throw Derek Jeter, I'm out and I'm done. And I think, frankly, anybody else, he probably gets thrown out because it's just such a audacious act. But everybody knew their history,
right?
And I think, okay, if Clemens beans him in the head, he gets ejected, whatever. But that happening, like Ken Davidoff of the New York Post wrote this week, the Post had a Subway Series insert, and he said, if you could come up with 1,000 things of how Piazza Clemens, their first at bat since Piazza got beaned, would turn out, that wouldn't be the top 1,000.
Right.
Ground out, a fly out, pop out, home run, brawl, beaning, whatever. Throwing a broken bat to guy.
Yeah.
No, nobody saw that coming in a million years. So I think that stunned everybody. And then Mike Hampton, didn't have the great stuff he had in the LCS, and the Yankees jumped out and cruised until that ninth inning when they scored 5 runs, and Jay Payton became the answer to a trivia question by becoming the last human to homer off Mariano Rivera in the postseason. Right. It's such a, and it's funny, like I just said, like it happened so quick, and yet it's going to be talked about forever. I mean, it's you hate to say it's the defining image of 2 Hall of Famers. I think Clemens gets in the Hall of Fame, and that's the top for another time. I think Clemens should be a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
But it's up there. I mean, Piazza's 9/11 home run probably a little more memorable.
Yeah. And depending on who, what you ask them for Clemens, there's going to be a lot. There's going to be off the field stuff that gets involved in that too. But
that's true. It's true.
Last thing I want to ask you here, because again, that win, like we talked about earlier, cements the legacy of the core 4. Yep. If the Mets win that World Series, I don't necessarily believe it turns the tide, because there's always that, 2015, Mets fans thought that they were going to take over New York City. Sorry. Yeah. No, that's not possible. New York will always and forever be a Yankee town. But if the Mets win that World Series, does it change the trajectory at all of the Mets franchise in the 2000s, and that 2006 team, that 2015 team? I mean, do those things even happen?
It's interesting. That's a really good question. I'm not sure it changes their trajectory, but it does change history, because there's only been one Subway Series, and the Mets have been generally stepbrothers for at that point 40 years, now almost 60 years.
Right.
But the one time they played, let's just say if the Mets won. If the Mets won that World Series, okay, you've got your 26 championships. But the one time we played, you kicked your,
Yep, exactly.
I mean, and like I'm 20 years ago, I would have said, that nullifies everything the Yankees did. Now, they won 3 titles in 4 years. Let's just say, for argument's sake, they lost to the Mets. I still think they're a dynasty. And 20 years later, we haven't seen a team win 2 in a row. Never mind 3.
Right.
Or never mind 3 out of 4, which the Yankees had done at that point. Now it's 4 out of 5. And really, a year later, it should have been 5 out of 6. But before the ninth inning. But so, like, if you look at it kind of outside, take a step out, like they won 3 out of 4, 96, 98, 99. They lost 2000. It's a phenomenal run. It hasn't been matched since then. It's one of the great runs of all time. They lost 2000, but they weren't a very good team. They lost 15-18 to end the year. They had the fewest wins of any playoff team. They'd run out of gas. But if you live in New York, it's a different story.
Yep.
Like the PR guy for the Yankees said, you don't lose to the Mets.
Right.
I started to say, basically what I'm saying to you, what you went through. No, he's actually banging the table. You don't lose to the Mets. And George was 70. He's 70. He was still really vibrant, and a few years later, his health started to decline. So that was still peak George.
Right.
So if you lose that year, it's real possible that not only that the fans think none of the previous years happened, and that they choked, and who knows what happens. I don't think I should say I don't think, but like 4 years later, they had the big collapse against the Red Sox, which to me is worse than that.
Yeah.
To me, that's worse than losing to the Mets.
Yep.
If you lose to the Mets in 7, it was a great series. You had the Red Sox 3 outs away from elimination and suffered the worst collapse in sports history.
Right.
No one got fired, but again, George was kind of he had kind of been declined a little bit, so maybe that's not a fair comp. But to go back to your original question, I don't know if it changes that trajectory, just because the Mets were already an older team. Piazza was 32, Ventura was 33, Jay Payton, their rookie, was 28 already. I mean, they were you see next year, 2001, they had a pretty terrible year for 4 months and got hot at the end. And in 2002, it collapsed and they finished in last place.
Right.
3 and 4, they were in last place. And by the time I got back in 6, it was a whole new core of guys.
Right.
But again, now Steve Phillips also said in the book, he thought that the Mets in 2000 were satisfied. They got to the World Series. You know, it was a hard road. They got there. Maybe 2001, they weren't as focused. They weren't as driven.
Right.
Maybe if they win in 2000, maybe all of a sudden then it's okay. We'll go get Alex Rodriguez to build on this. You know, all of a sudden he's not a 24-1 guy. All of a sudden it's we're the defending world champions, and we can get the best shortstop in baseball, the best hitter in baseball, to pair with the best catcher in baseball, and we'll worry about, you know. And so then if you don't sign Mike Hampton, you got Alex Rodriguez, Mike Piazza batting 3-4. He's doing all right.
Yep.
So it's interesting. It's interesting how maybe, you know, I don't think, you know, knowing what we know about the Wilpons, I don't think that would have changed how they pursued that offseason. And if anything, it might have been like, hey, we won. We're the best team in New York. Yeah, we don't need A-Rod. But it's also, you know, it's fun to think about the other side of the what if. Like, okay, maybe they are more passionate and more aggressive to stay on top. My guess is, you know, that doesn't change anything. The Mets will still taper off. And look, at the Yankees tapered off too. They probably should have won in 2001, but, you know, they didn't get back to the World Series again until 2009. Haven't been back there since. So I think both teams, you know, their cores were getting older, and, you know, what the Yankees did was remarkable and draining. They basically played an extra season's worth of playoff games in that run.
Right.
I think that season, that if it, you know, I think that probably win or lose was probably the peak, probably represent the end of the peak for both teams. But sure, it's fun to wonder. You know, I have more fun pondering the what ifs in 2000. You know, how does that change the legacies of those teams? How does it change, you know, how the Mets are viewed in the city? Because if you win that World Series, you've won. Yeah, like I said, you've won 25 World Championships, but the Mets are 1-0 against you in the World Series.
Right.
And so it would be, you know, fascinating to see how the fan base would react to that. And again, it goes back to the Yankees couldn't lose that, no matter what. And the Mets were kind of in a no-lose position, fan base and team. If you lose, you're the Mets. You know, you're not supposed to win. If you won, it changed everything. So I think the trajectories would remain the same. I think, maybe it doesn't take 15 years for the Mets to get back, but I don't think that would have changed the long-term, their long-term trajectory. It would have been interesting to see what happens to the Yankees if they lose, if they start breaking it up. But again, those guys, you're not trading Jeter. Paul's 37, going on 38. Tino's in his last year of his contract. It would have been interesting to see how George would respond to Cashman and Torrey, but we look back at it now, and that was the end of that run. They had one more, and they should have won in 01, and that was it. So it's not like, firing them would have shortened the run. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's interesting. It sure is fun. And Todd Pratt says, I don't know if we win game one, but now you're up 1-0. You've bloodied their nose. You've punched them in the nose the first time. And they've never been down in a series, in a World Series. Since 96, they've been down once. They were down to Cleveland 2-1 in 98. Other than that, they're always playing from ahead. So, who knows? I'm sorry. They're also trailing Oakland they were never trailing the World Series since 2-0 in Atlanta. So who knows how they react if they're down? And going back to our topic from earlier, if Clemens has to pitch from behind, who knows? So that to me is the most fun part of the what ifs. How do their narratives change in that pocket of window there? If the Mets can somehow win game one and win the series, it would be fascinating to see.
It's a great book on the history of New York City baseball. It's a great look back at the seismic meaning of a Subway Series and what it did for two really historic franchises and two pinnacle cornerstone players, of course, and obviously Piazza and Clemens, and looking back at that. But it's also got some great pop culture references, which I always know I'm going to get from you. A Boston Public reference was not what I was expecting reading it, but I absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
Jerry,
they had the Stars sitting there at the field, game one. I looked it up. Oh, yeah, it started Monday night. Great.
Jerry Beach, as always, buddy, it's great talking to you. The Subway Series, baseball's Big Apple Battles, and the Yankees-Mets 2000 World Series. Go out, buy it now. Teach yourself the history of New York City baseball, even if you aren't a New Yorker, because it is some of the best baseball that there is. Jerry, we appreciate it.
Thanks, Christian. Be good, be safe, be healthy, and hopefully get a full baseball season next year.
100%. All right, that's Jerry Beach, author of the Subway Series, baseball's Big Apple Battles, and the Mets-Yankees 2000 World Series. Like I mentioned, it's a lot of fun to read back and look at the history of that series, what it meant to the sport, what it meant to the country at the time. Obviously not knowing what it meant to the country, what would happen just 11 months later. But it's interesting to look back and see what could have happened and what did happen. And just, I love books like this because they teach you so much about the history of the game and some stories that we never would have known if not going back and looking at them. So check it out. Buy it wherever you can buy books. Again, Jerry Beach, the Subway Series, baseball's Big Apple Battles, and the Mets-Yankees 2000 World Series. Really appreciate his time. Really appreciate you guys listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share with your friends and family, and find us on social media. Till next week, I'm Christian Heimall. You have been caught listening.